During the American Civil War, there was intense and ferocious fighting in many battles that resulted in the deaths of many. The war between the Union and the Confederacy saw its believed between 625,000 to 750,000 soldiers dead, and there were many other civilian casualties. It was the deadliest conflict fought on American soil. But during this conflict there were a number of prisoner of war camps established by the Confederacy, and one of these camps was Camp Sumter, which was also known as Andersonville Prison. It was a sight of pure horror and was where thousands of Union prisoners were held, and nearly 13,000 of them would never get out as they succumbed to the diseases of the camp, and also the fact they had inadequate water and food supplies. Camp Sumter was described as hell, but what is the story of it? Join us today to look at the brutal torture of the American Civil War's most awful prisoner of war camp. And remember, as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Camp Sumter opened in February 1864, and to begin with it covered around 16 acres of land, and was enclosed by a 15-foot high wooden palisade fence. But within a few months it had almost doubled in size, and there were 2 entrances to the site. The amount of prisoners held inside meant that each prisoner had roughly a space of around 5 feet by 6 feet. As time went on and the camp expanded, this meant that more prisoners were sent there. The conditions there were truly terrible, and many of the inmates suffered from health problems. The Confederacy began to struggle to obtain sufficient food for themselves, let alone prisoners of war, and those who were held inside of Camp Sumter received much less food than the guards did. Their poor diets resulted in scurvy problems at the site, and there was also a high mortality rate, and dysentery and typhoid fever also swept through the camp. The living conditions were also filthy due to poor sanitation, and the only source of drinking water was from a creek that also doubled up as the camp's toilet. It was filled at all times with human waste from thousands of ill people. There were no new clothes given to prisoners, and their clothing was often rags, and clothes were then taken from the dead. It was said of this by one prisoner, before one was fairly cold his clothes would be appropriated and divided, and I have seen many sharp fights between contesting claimants. There was also a lack of wood, despite the camp being surrounded by forests, for inmates to use for fires to keep warm or cook. The food rations they received often were not cooked because of a lack of utensils, and the prisoners were suffering heavily. Around a third died within 7 months of the camp's opening. One former inmate said of Camp Sumter, "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but merely walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feelings, exclaimed with earnestness, 'Can this be hell? God protect us!' And although that He alone could bring them out alive from such a terrible place. In the centre of the whole was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits, and a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the centre rising from which was suffocating. The ground allotted to our 90 was near the edge of this plague spot, and how we were to live through the warm summer weather, in the midst of such fearful surroundings, was more than we cared to just think of just then." Another former prisoner said the newcomers on reaching this would exclaim, "Is this hell?" Yet they soon would become callous and enter unmoved the horrible rottenness. The rebel authorities never removed any filth. There was seldom any visitation by the officers in charge. The clothing of the men was miserable in the extreme. Very few had shoes of any kind, not 2,000 had coats and pants, and those were latecomers. More than one half were indecently exposed, and many were naked. The proportion of deaths from starvation, not including those consequent on the diseases originating in the character and limited quantity of food, such as the diarrhoea, dysentery and scurvy, I cannot state, but to the best of my knowledge, information and belief, there were scores every month. We could at any point out many from whom such a fate was inevitable, as they lay or feebly walked mere skeletons. There was a part of the camp which was also known as the dead line. This was marked by a small fence, and was said to have been no man's land, that kept prisoners away from the wall. It was made from roughly cut logs, and stakes were driven into the ground to keep inmates away from there. Anyone who was found touching or encroaching on the dead line was shot immediately by the guards and sentries who patrolled it. It's likely that some prisoners walked in there to end their suffering. At this time the concept of a prisoner of war camp was new, and there was little laws relating to the treatment of prisoners also. Survival inside Camp Sumter depended on the social network the person had, and whether they could rely upon others to help them out. These networks did exist at the camp, and prisoners would trade food and clothes with each other, and also offer protection against other inmates. It was found that having a strong social network in the camp had a higher chance that the inmate would survive, and to the prisoners it offered them a sense of companionship. But others were not there to make friends. There was one group of inmates called the Anderson Raiders, who attacked and stole food, clothes and money from other inmates. They were armed with clubs and they killed to get their own way. One group was established to try and prevent this, and they caught most of the raiders, and they were subject to severe punishment. They were forced to run the gauntlet, where they were beaten by other prisoners, or were thrown in the stocks, and 6 people were even hanged for their crimes. It was seen as a disgrace that prisoners were doing this and stealing from others, leaving them often to dead. But in July 1864, Captain Henry Wirz, the Commandant, even freed 5 Union prisoners to deliver a petition signed by the prisoners of the camp to reinstate prisoner exchanges to allow some inmates to be released due to the overcrowding. But during the American Civil War, 45,000 prisoners were sent to Andersonville, and around 13,000 of them died. Most of the deaths were caused by the Confederate policies towards Union prisoners, and the fact they did not care for them. Many died from disease and starvation because of this, but at the time there was food shortages across the Confederate states. Also, the prison guards and officials were rather poor, and their running of the site was not good enough. Some inmates tried to plan escapes, and some formed groups that planned to burrow out of the camp, using a network of tunnels, which they hoped would come out in the nearby forest. But as people became sicker and the conditions got worse, escape was made very difficult due to the health of the prisoners. Around 100 a day were dying, and some prisoners would even pretend to be dead, so they would be carried out to the row of dead bodies outside the wall. When night came they would get up and run, and once the Commandant Henry Wirz learned of this, he said that all bodies should be examined by a doctor before they were removed. The camp was liberated in May 1865, and the prisoners were described as being human skeletons amid hellish scenes of desolation. But Henry Wirz, the Commandant of Camp Sumter, was brought to a war crimes trial. He was forced to hear of the conditions of the site, and many said he was guilty of some acts of cruelty and killing with his bare hands. But other witnesses said he was not even present at the camp much, or that he had tried to make things better. He presented evidence that he tried to get more food, but this was not good enough, and because of this Henry Wirz was sentenced to death and was hanged. Camp Sumter, or Andersonville Prison, was a horrific Confederate prisoner of war camp, which saw around 13,000 people die within the fences. It was a site where there was mass starvation and disease would spread quickly around. It was a true hell on earth, and was a site where the guards did not care for the inmates. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.